In this lecture, I plan to deal with what I regard as turning points in Alexander's war against King Darius III of Persia. These are the years 333 and 332 BC. And at the Battle of Issus, late in that year, probably fought in November of 333 BC, Alexander decisively defeated the Persian king himself. In early next year, Alexander captured two important cities, Tyre and Gaza. These are cities that are still in the headlines today, and they represented, in effect, the gateway to Egypt. And by these decisive victories, one battle and two sieges, Alexander essentially conquered the western half of the Persian Empire. And it was a stupendous achievement, for he did it in just a little under 3 years. It is doubtful that any of the Greek pan-Hellenists, or even Philip of Macedon himself, considered that this could have been done by them. It clearly is a remarkable military achievement, and we accept Alexander's career as a given, and it's difficult sometimes to appreciate what was involved in these stupendous victories. I last discussed Alexander's army wintering at Gordion on the great Anatolian plateau, and it was in high spirits. Alexander had ordered the various satrapies of Western Asia Minor, had appointed Macedonians. He was greeted by all of the native peoples. He had liberated the Greek cities. He had no problems with provisions, and above all, he was receiving reinforcements from Macedon. In early 333, probably May, and that would be the time most armies would move out when the grain is essentially milk ripe. That is, you can eat it. It's not the best, but at least you can eat it. Any earlier, and the winter grains in the Mediterranean world are just inedible. So he moved out in May of 333 BC with the intention of crossing the Taurus Mountains, which is the great boundary that divides Asiatic Turkey today from the Middle East. And in antiquity, the ancients believed that that mountain range, to some extent, was much more of a barrier dividing Europe from Asia than the sea, with good reason. Alexander's army moved to seize the traditional route known as the Cilician Gates. This gave access from the plateau of Central Asia Minor to the southeastern littoral of Turkey today, an area known as Cilicia, a very humid region, but absolutely rich in agriculture and many cities, most of them homes to Aramaic speakers, people related to the Phoenicians on the shores of the Levant. The advance was rapid. Alexander took his crack Agrianians, his archers, several regiments of phalanx and companions, and surprised the Persian guard at the Cilician Gates, secured it with very little fighting, and the Macedonian army marched through the gates into Cilicia. At that point, Alexander apparently fell ill from a chill that he got when he swam in one of the local rivers, the Kindus River, near the ancient city of Tarsus, which is still to be excavated and is known to many people as the home of St. Paul, and at the time was really the major city of Cilicia and essentially the capital of the satrapy. He fell ill there from this chill, and through much of the summer probably was convalescing from a very bad fever that nearly killed him. And considering the difficulties of traveling over all these unknown locations and new places and the different types of food, the wounds he sustained in battle, it's remarkable that Alexander and so many of his Macedonians ever managed to get back home, or at least get back to Babylon 10 years later. While Alexander was convalescing in Cilicia, King Darius III was not idle. He assembled a vast army, especially from the eastern satrapies, that is, the upper satrapies of Central Asia and Iran. He hired many more Greek mercenaries. He had entrusted to Memnon and Rhodes a fleet that sailed into the Aegean. These ships were largely manned by Cypriot Greeks and Phoenicians. There were also some Egyptians. And the idea was to raise rebellions in the Greek world. They would get a ready welcome from King Agis III at Sparta, who wanted to cooperate with the Persians. And initially, the Persians made some headway. A number of the Greek islands were captured, the island of Chios in particular. Persian forces landed on the island of Lesbos, put Mytilene under siege. But Memnon died, probably of illness, and he was succeeded by his brother-in-law, Phranabazus. And what happened to this operation is it essentially lost impetus. Antipater launched his own fleet, and Alexander's victory at Issus essentially negated the Persian successes in the Aegean, which we'll get to in a moment. The Persian army under Darius III assembled at Babylon, which is one of the richest areas of the ancient Near East, the other being Egypt. It alone had the sort of grain supply that could feed such a huge army. And he marched that army north to Syria, to the Great Amuk Plain, just north of the later city of Antioch, today Antakya, on the Orontes River. And by the late summer of 333 BC, there was a massive Persian army on the upper Euphrates, which was essentially eating Darius out of house and home. Darius was hoping, with his superior Iranian cavalry, numbering perhaps anywhere, maybe 15,000, maybe 20,000, his Greek mercenaries and all of his Asiatic levies, that he could lure Alexander into a battle on the plains of Syria and encircle and destroy the invader's army. However, Alexander was nowhere to be seen, and what Darius didn't realize is Alexander was ill and was spending much of the summer convalescing. There are two anecdotes that have come down through the literary sources that are very telling, and I would like to read both of them because they capture a bit of the difference between Alexander and Darius. In the case of Alexander, while he was convalescing, his physician, Philip of Acarnania, which is in western Greece, was administering different types of medications and potions to the king. And Parmenio, who is the second in command of the army and I always think doubles as sort of the intelligence officer for Alex. He's always intercepting letters of potential conspirators. Apparently got word that Philip, the physician, was hired by Darius to poison Alexander. And this comes from Arrian, and it's a very, this comes from Plutarch, and it's a very telling incident. Meanwhile, Parmenio had sent Alexander a letter from the camp warning him to beware of Philip, that's the physician, since Darius, he said, had promised him large sums of money and even the hand of his daughter if he would kill Alexander. Alexander read the letter and put it under his pillow without showing it to any of his friends. Then at the appointed hour, when Philip entered the room with the king's companions carrying the medicine in a cup, Alexander handed him the letter and took the drop from him cheerfully and without the least sign of misgiving. It was an astonishing scene and one well worthy of the stage. The one man reading the letter and the other drinking the physic, and then each gazing into the face of the other, although not with the same expression. The king's serene and open smile clearly displayed his friendly feelings towards Philip and his trust in him, while Philip was filled with surprise and alarm at the accusation, at one moment lifting his hands to heaven and protesting his innocence before the gods, that's a classic act of supplication, and the next falling upon his knees by the bed and imploring Alexander to take courage and follow his advice. At first, the drug completely overpowered him, that is, Alexander, and as it were, drove all his vital forces out of sight. He became speechless, fell into a swoon, and displayed scarcely any sign of sense or of life. However, Philip quickly restored him, that is, Alexander, to consciousness, and when he had regained his strength, he showed himself to the Macedonians, who would not be consoled until they had seen their king. A very telling incident of Alexander's confidence and his ability to read people's loyalty. And these are the types of stories associated with Alexander, and it really does become a choice of the scholar or the general reader to either accept or reject these in constructing an idea of what Alexander was really like. And I don't think, given the number of these stories, that they're all simply invented. They at least had to be plausible to Plutarch's readership, because they do go back to incidents and reports from Alexander's own lifetime. Meanwhile, Darius was assembling his great army. And as most Persian monarchs, they employed large numbers of Greek mercenaries. And in the case of Darius, he had on hand the Athenian general Charidemus. I've mentioned him before. He was actually a native Euboean who got Athenian citizenship for his services to Athens. He was an extraordinarily talented mercenary commander. He had served Chersiplebtus of Thrace, who was the opponent of Philip II. He had fought for the Athenians in the Chalcidice and the Hellespontine regions. He had fled Athens when Philip and Alexander took power. And he then took service with Darius III. While Alexander was convalescent in Cilicia, we are told by Quintus Curtius Rufus that Darius was having his own conferences with his commanders. And here is a comment from Curtius Rufus that gives some indication what Darius was like. Darius was of a mild and placid disposition, but even natural inclinations are generally corrupted by fortune. This is a typical Roman view of the imperial age. Unable to take the truth he had, Charidemus dragged off to execution. This is because Charidemus had told Darius not to fight Alexander in Cilicia, not to fight him in the narrow areas, but to lure Alexander out into Syria. So he had Charidemus dragged off to execution, a guest and suppliant though he was, and at the time when he was making very useful recommendations. Even in these circumstances, Charidemus did not forget that he was a free man. This was typical of the Greek conceit. He was a citizen of Athens. And he says, these are quotes, "I have the avenger of my death ready at hand," he declared. "You will pay the penalty for rejecting my advice, and pay it to the very man against whom it was given. As for you, so suddenly transformed by your unlimited power, you shall be an example to posterity of how men can forget even their natural inclinations when they have surrendered themselves to fortune." And he's then dragged out shouting. The incident is telling. It reveals a great deal about Roman attitudes in all of this, but it seems to ring true that Darius was in a very precarious position. He would like to be generous and noble. He was committed to fighting a major battle because he had to look credible in the eyes of his nobility. And therefore, he ordered the execution of this veteran Athenian general who had given him very, very good strategic advice, and that later became evident. So what happened in the late summer and autumn of 333 BC, the two armies essentially were in the same general vicinity, but they had made no contact. When Alexander recovered, he moved his armies across the plain of Cilicia and then pressed south along the shores of Phoenicia, obviously heading for the Phoenician ports. He descended into the region that is today known as the Hatay in Turkey. It's often called Turkish Syria. Meanwhile, Darius III had grown impatient. It was late in the season, probably November of 333. We have reason to believe that. And he moved with his main army over the Taurus Mountains and came in from the east by well-known passes and descended into Cilicia, into eastern Cilicia, and found no Alexander. So he turned south and began to press along the eastern Mediterranean shore. And what he did is he ran into Alexander's forces, that is, his forces detached in the backfield, his wounded, and realized that Alexander was ahead of him. Alexander had moved from that area of the Hatay into Syria proper by crossing the Belan Pass, an enormous pass that allows for access into Syria. It leads into the Yamuk Plain. The reason Alexander did this is that he had reports of movement of the Persian army south towards Damascus. And what it was is Darius had told his officers to send the provisions, the royal family, large parts of the treasury, all the non-combatants to Damascus, and this was mistaken as a major Persian movement south towards Damascus. Once Alexander got over the pass, it was confirmed that that was not really the Persian army and that Darius was behind him because men came in from the region around the river Panaris, where there had been a base, reporting that the Persian army was strategically behind Alexander and that the army was cut off. Alexander took this simply as a challenge rather than discourage. He told his men, "We have him. Darius has moved into a very narrow area. He will be hemmed in between the mountains and the water, that is the Mediterranean Sea." And he rested his army, and before dawn on the next day, he got his army up. They recrossed the Belan Pass and marched north. And waiting for them at the river Panaris, today the Pias, close to the city of Issus, the ancient city of Issus, which has now been uncovered by a team from Bilkent University, conducted by the excavations conducted by Marie-Henriette Gates and Charles Gates. We now know where the site is. It's been confirmed. The Persian army was waiting, drawn up behind the riverbank. And so you had a situation similar to Granicus, where Darius III now occupied the ground and prepared to receive Alexander's attack. Alexander's army again came out of line of march into line of battle. They assembled on the battlefield late in the day, sometime in November of 333. He could see immediately what Darius had in mind. Darius had massed most of his cavalry on his right wing, which is along the coastal plain, and therefore he sent forth the Thessalian and Greek cavalry under Parmenio to check it. He saw that the Persian center was held largely by Greek mercenary infantry. But on either side of the Persian infantry center were Persian infantry known as Cardaces in the sources. They apparently were light armed, and they were screened by archers. Behind was the mass of the Persian army that really couldn't do anything until the battle was joined because there just wasn't enough room. Off to Alexander's far right in the mountains was a Persian detachment that was supposed to take Alexander in the rear. Well, Alexander sent forces up there that drove off that detachment, and therefore he was protected in the rear. And then he drew up his army in classic style. Parmenio commanded the left wing towards the sea. He had the Thessalian and Greek cavalry. They received the Persian cavalry charge as it came across the Panaris. The phalanx was drawn up in the center. The high pacifists held the far right of the infantry. Then there was the companion cavalry and the various light armed. The army was drawn up in an absolutely dramatic display. And again, you must think of the Persians and Greek mercenaries as standing there all day waiting for the Macedonian army, very impatient, the horses skittish, and particularly those Persian infantry units on their left and right wings screened by archers. These men were apparently not tough professional heavy infantry. The fact that they had archers in front of them indicated that the archers were supposed to volley, and then the infantry would open ranks and the archers would retire through them, and then the infantry would close up and receive the Macedonian attack. At least that was the idea, and there was no way in the world these guys were able to perform this. In fact, they show all the indications of soldiers without experience, and their immediate attitude in the battle was that Alexander is after me directly to kill. In that instance, on the battlefield, as Alexander ordered his army, he knew where the weak point was. The terrain at Issus is known, and on the south bank, on the right flank of the Macedonians, the hill there is considerably higher than where the Persian infantry and archers were drawn up. And Alexander knew that if he could throw his cavalry against this infantry formation, it would probably break. He would have the advantage of the incline. The Persian forces would be shooting their arrows uphill. They would fall short. And he expected that they would panic, that he could flank Darius's army. The phalanx would attack across the river and engage the Greek mercenaries, and he could get around the Persian army and capture Darius. And that final scene is dramatically depicted on the Pompeii mosaic in the Naples Archaeological Museum, probably based on an original painting. Some think it was done by Apelles, some would argue Lysippus. There's several artists who are proposed. But it is based on an original painting from Alexander's own day. And that's how the battle opened. The Macedonian army came out with complete drill precision. I'm sure the Persians looked at it in awe. Darius was standing in the center of his army in his chariot looking at, I wish my army could do that. And Alexander, as always, mounted on Bucephalus with magnificent armor, encouraged his army. And he appealed to all of his forces according to what most motivated him. To the Greeks, he gave speeches to the men pointing out, I know you're heroic. I know what you have done. We are going to avenge the burning of the temples of Athens and bring this war to the Persian foe. To the Macedonians, he appealed to his father Philip and the fact that the Macedonians were the greatest soldiers in the world. And the cheers went up everywhere as the army looked ever more ferocious and daunting to the Persian side. And finally, when he got to his Illyrian and Thracian forces, he simply pointed to the Persians and said, enemy, kill, loot, and they got the message. These guys they're in more for the avarice side of the campaign. Once the army was ready and moved in motion, the Persian cavalry swung into action. Parmenio received it, and there was a cavalry battle on the left in which Parmenio distinguished himself as always. The Macedonian army moved into the riverbank and fought a very hard battle against the Greek hoplites. But the real key was Alexander's charge on the right. As the companion cavalry moved up and began to move at the trot, the Persian archers threw away their volley. They probably fired too soon. The arrows fell short. They immediately turned panicked, ran into their infantry, said, let us through. The infantry got confused, and within moments, the companion cavalry and the supporting light-armed infantry were down and across the river, and the entire Persian left flank went down. Alexander's cavalry circled around to take Darius in the rear, and Darius, seeing this, he was atop a great chariot in the center with his household cavalry, and that was a typical battle line for the Persians, so the great king could order his forces, knew that within moments Alexander would be behind him, so he leaped out of his chariot, got on a mare, and rode off the battlefield. And at that point, much of the Persian infantry that was drawn up behind the front line panicked and ran. The cavalry on the Persian side acquitted itself very well. It retired in good order. The Greek mercenaries fought on until there was no hope and did a fighting withdrawal, but essentially the Persian army was shattered. The losses are difficult to estimate. Losses on the Macedonian side were extremely light. And most historians suspect they only ran a couple of hundred at most, more men wounded and damaged in trying to cross the river. Persian losses were extremely high, but many of them were wounded and missing in action. Many of them died months later from privation because they essentially scattered. But what you would say is essentially the Persian army as a fighting effective force was over. The main Persian field army had been smashed in a matter of 10 minutes due to a cavalry charge on the Levantine shores of the Mediterranean. It was a stunning victory. And Darius was lucky to escape. He rallied his Greek mercenaries and cavalry and moved east towards Babylon. Some historians have criticized Alexander for not pursuing Darius, or at least not marching his army on to Babylon, but Alexander strategically knew what he was doing. He had very little choice except to keep pressing south, because he still had to worry about that Persian fleet in the Aegean. Pharnabazus and the subordinate commanders were making some headway among the Greeks. There were negotiations with Agis III of Sparta, who was asking money and mercenaries, meaning Greek mercenaries, to raise a rebellion in the Peloponnesus. And the Macedonian fleet was just too small to engage the Persian fleet. But when the news came of Issus, it was clear to many of the Cypriots and Phoenicians that their home cities would soon be occupied, and that's what Alexander did. He moved down the shores of Phoenicia. Most of the cities welcomed him. Sidon, Beirut, Byblos, Abydos, all went over. The Greek kings of Cyprus, particularly at Salamis, saw Alexander as one of their own, and that meant most of the Persian fleet essentially went home. They were not about to fight for King Darius III when their home cities were now in the possession of Alexander. There was only one city that opposed Alexander, and it was hoped by Darius and the Persian high command that this city could hold up Alexander's advance and prevent Alexander from entering Egypt. And that was the city of Tyre, a city that is now very much in the headlines. And Tyre was the leading city of Phoenicia. It had received a great deal of privileges from the great king. The fleet of the king of Tyre was regarded as the best. It was the hometown of Carthage, so it had possible reinforcements from Carthage in the western Mediterranean. And the then reigning king, Azamelech, decided to hold on for Darius. Now, at the time, Tyre was essentially two cities. There was one on the mainland, but across the way was an island, about half a mile out. And that's where the royal palace and main temples were, and it was surrounded by impressive walls, 150 feet high. It had two major harbors, one north, one south. They were known as the Sidonian and Egyptian harbors, based on the direction in which the harbors faced. And the city on the mainland surrendered promptly enough. But Alexander sent a request to the Tyrians. Their king at that particular moment was actually serving in the Persian fleet and arrived later, and said that he wanted to come into the island city and sacrifice to the leading god of Tyre, Melkart, whom Alexander identified with Heracles, his ancestor, because Melkart and Heracles both have clubs, so, maybe they're the same god. The Tyrians refused because this would have been a religious act that would have made Alexander king of their city. Alexander probably knew that, and in January of 332 BC, he ordered the city put under siege. It was a stupendous feat of engineering. And in 6 months, what Alexander and his engineers did was essentially turn Tyre from an island into a peninsula. The various fleets from the other Phoenician and Cypriot cities returned. They helped in putting the city under siege. A vast mole was built out and protected. Great towers and battering rams were positioned, and the fleet of the Tyrians was defeated. And it was just a relentless, inevitable siege in which the city was taken. The Macedonians made a breach and poured in, captured the city. Some 30,000 were enslaved. Actually, the king and royal family was, treated with respect. It was a record-breaking siege, and it was really a testimony to the success of Alexander and Philip with their siege train. There was only one other city that resisted, and that was the city of Gaza, which was at the far southern end of the Levantine shore. Gaza, an old Philistine city, was on a high position, and it was a Persian garrison, largely Arab mercenaries, commanded by a Persian named Battus. And this city was captured in less than 2 months because what Alexander realizes, what we do is build a series of ramps, what the Romans call an auger, which is essentially a great box, at several points to the city, move towers in place, and storm into it, and that's exactly what he did. Between January and July of 332 BC, Tyre fell in a great siege, and then 2 months later, so did Gaza. The whole of the Levant, that is the regions today known as Syria, Lebanon, which is ancient Phoenicia, Israel, Jordan, these areas were now under Alexander's control. And actually, in the later Jewish tradition, they have very fond memories of Alexander because, as in most instances, he allowed the Jews to live under their own laws and respected the temple at Jerusalem. It was a stunning victory, and it confirmed the success at Issus. It is difficult to understand the impact of these sieges. The city of Tyre had been besieged by Assyrian and Babylonian armies to no effect. It is reported that King Nebuchadnezzar II, the man who captured Jerusalem and deported the Jews in the Babylonian captivity, spent 13 years trying to take the city and finally had to agree to terms. So the capture of Tyre just resounded through the Mediterranean world. It was stunning. And I'm sure Darius was extremely dispirited because he expected at least Tyre to hold out for a couple of years in time for him to assemble another army and fight Alexander somewhere west of the Euphrates River. It was further embarrassing to Darius that Issus had another result, and that was after the flight of the Persian army, that Alexander essentially captured the whole baggage train and royal tent and the harem of Darius shortly after the battle. And that included Darius's wives, his various daughters, his very, very young son, and above all, the queen mother, Gambis, and all of them were now in Alexander's possession. And this really was a humiliation for Darius and began to compromise him in the eyes of his nobility that he couldn't even defend his own royal family. And apparently many other high-ranking Persian ladies of the imperial aristocracy were captured at the same time. A major treasury was captured at Damascus, again solving Alexander's financial problems, but the capture of the royal family was particularly embarrassing. And we have reports in the sources of at least 3 different offers made by Darius for peace terms. The first was a demand of the return of his family, but that didn't work. The final offer was apparently, this is, we think, the third offer on the table, either after the fall of Tyre or perhaps in the next year. The Arian and the other sources dispute on this, but the third offer was a hand in marriage of Darius's oldest daughter, as well as an indemnity of 10,000 talents or something, and all the Persian Empire west of the Euphrates. And Alexander wrote back to Darius and said, essentially, look, I have all of this anyway, and by the way, in future, address me as Lord of Asia. Parmenio is reputed to have said with this last offer, if I were Alexander, I would take it. And Alexander quips back, well, if I were Parmenio, I would take it too. And it's, part of that interplay where Parmenio is the foil. What was remarkable, and again, this is a story that is told in the particularly in Arian, we get versions of it in the other accounts. When Alexander actually sprang upon the tent of Darius, there are 2 events associated with that. First, he saw the Persian dinner table laid out, and the Persian kings didn't rough it when they went on campaign. And when Alexander and his best friend Hephaestion came in right off the battlefield, in armor, Alexander looked at it and said, now this is what it is to be a king. He could see the great opulence and wealth of the great king of Persia. The second was that the entire royal family, all of these high-born women, prostrated themselves and supplicated Alexander for mercy. They had no idea what would happen. And actually, the queen mother made the mistake of addressing Hephaestion as Alex, because Hephaestion was rather tall, and Alexander wasn't particularly tall. And when the mistake was pointed out, she was really aghast at the mistake and wondered what would happen. And Alexander said, no. He, Hephaestion, is Alexander too, also. And it was an incredible piece of nobility. He treated the royal Persian family with complete nobility. There was nothing done against them. And he was respectful to all the Persian aristocratic ladies. And Arrian, writing years later, based on Ptolemy's account, said that about this whole incident, he wasn't sure it was true or not, but this is how he puts it. I have written down without asserting its truth or total incredibility. If it really happened, I approve of Alexander's compassion for the women and of the trust and honor bestowed on his companion, that is Hephaestion. And the Greek words there are eston heteron pisteos kai times. And these are very, very powerful words of trust and friendship. You know, Hephaestion is Alexander too. If the historians of Alexander think it plausible that he would have acted and spoken this way, I approve of Alexander on that ground too. That is, if the story is not historical, it ought to be, because it is the way Alexander would have acted and would have spoken. It's one of the many incidents scattered through the sources, which I do think gives some sort of perspective into this young conqueror. Alexander had not only conquered the western half of the Persian Empire, he now had the royal family. And he treated it with the respect that would be accorded to the noble women of a very noble foe. And at the same time, Alexander was ready to move on to his next conquest, Egypt, the fabled land of the Nile, and then he would turn to face Darius once more.